They laughed at her in court, but this defendant wasn't who they thought she was. She came prepared to rewrite the rules. The courtroom was packed. The kind of scene you'd expect in a high-profile case, not a routine hearing. People whispered, their murmurs blending into a low buzz that filled the room. At the center of it all stood a young black teenager, maybe 17 tops. Her sneakers squeaked slightly as she shifted on the cold, polished floor. She didn't look nervous, though, not like someone accused of a serious crime. Her expression was calm, her hands steady. But the judge? He wasn't buying it. Judge Harold Breener leaned back in his chair, his robe draped over his bulky frame, like it had been hastily thrown on. He peered down at the girl through his glasses, the corner of his mouth curling in what could only be described as disdain. Miss Freeman, he said, drawing out her last name like it left a bad taste in his mouth. Do you even understand what you're being accused of here? The room fell silent, all eyes darting between the judge and the girl. She didn't flinch. She didn't fumble with her words like he probably expected. Instead, she met his gaze, calm and composed, and said, "Yes, Your Honor, I do." The judge tapped his pen against the desk, the rhythm sharp and deliberate. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, flipping through the file in front of him. "The prosecution may proceed." The district attorney, a tall man with slick back hair and a polished demeanor, rose from his chair. He shot a glance at the young girl, his smirk almost a mirror of the judge's. "Your Honor, this is an open and shut case. The evidence speaks for itself," he began, pacing confidently as if the girl weren't even in the room. The defendant, a minor, was found at the scene in possession of materials clearly linking her to. Objection. Her voice cut through the courtroom like a sharp blade. Calm, measured, and entirely unexpected. The DA froze mid-sentence, spinning on his heel to look at her. The gallery stirred, whispers swelling again. Judge Brenner raised an eyebrow. "Objection," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Miss Freeman, do you even know what that means?" She met his gaze, unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, unfazed. "The prosecutor is making assumptions about my intent without providing context. That's speculative and inadmissible." A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. The DA stumbled over his next words, glaring at her like she had just ruined his perfectly scripted moment. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "No," she interrupted smoothly. "What's irregular is a lack of actual evidence tying me to any criminal activity." The judge's gavel hit the desk with a loud crack. "That's enough," he snapped, his face growing redder by the second. "Miss Freeman, you are here to defend yourself, not to play lawyer. One more outburst like that, and I'll hold you in contempt." Her expression didn't waver. "Understood, Your Honor." The DA cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. He turned to the judge, attempting to brush off the moment. "As I was saying, permission to approach the bench." The courtroom gasped audibly this time. Judge Brenner stared at her, his face now a mix of irritation and disbelief. "You don't get to make demands in my courtroom," he barked. "I'm not making a demand, Your Honor. I'm exercising my right to present a fair defense," she countered, her tone steady, unshaken. "But if you're not willing to hear me out, I'll file a motion for recusal due to judicial bias." Silence. Deafening silence. The judge leaned back in his chair, narrowing his eyes as if trying to figure out what game she was playing. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said after a long pause. She didn't flinch. "Fine. Approach." She stepped forward, her sneakers squeaking again on the polished floor. Every eye in the room followed her, the weight of their stares pressing down on her. But she walked like she didn't feel it. She placed a stack of papers on the bench in front of the judge, her hands steady as she slid them forward. "This is a preliminary review of the evidence submitted by the prosecution," she said, her voice even. "If you'll notice, half of it is circumstantial, and the rest lacks proper chain of custody." Judge Brenner glanced at the papers, his frown deepening as he skimmed through them. The DA looked like he was ready to explode. "Your Honor, this is absurd. She can't." "She can," the judge muttered, cutting him off. He flipped through a few more pages before looking up at her. "Where did you get this?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "I prepared it. And how exactly does a teenager like you know how to do this?" She hesitated just for a moment before replying. "I read." The judge's eyes narrowed further. The courtroom fell silent again. People leaned forward in their seats as if they couldn't help themselves. Something about her confidence was starting to make them wonder, who is this girl really? The judge's face twisted in confusion and frustration as he shuffled through the stack of papers Harper had just placed before him. He was searching for a flaw, a mistake, anything to dismiss her arguments entirely. But there was nothing. Every point she made was airtight. "Miss Freeman," he said, his tone laced with skepticism, "where did you learn how to construct something like this?" Harper didn't flinch. She stood tall, her expression unwavering. "Like I said, Your Honor, I read. A lot." The district attorney was far less composed. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We're wasting time. She's a child. This isn't a debate club." But the judge held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes locked onto Harper, studying her as if seeing her for the first time. "Who are you really?" The question hung in the air. A murmur rippled through the gallery. People leaned forward, whispering in hushed voices. Harper met the judge's gaze without hesitation. "I'm someone who understands the law better than most people in this room," she said, her voice even, carrying a quiet edge. "And I'm here to prove it." Gasps spread through the courtroom. The weight of her words settled over the room. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Enough games. What's your point, Miss Freeman?" Harper squared her shoulders. "My point, Your Honor, is that I'm not just a teenager standing trial." She let the words sink in. Then she delivered the blow. "I'm an attorney." The courtroom exploded. Gasps, murmurs, disbelief. A few people outright exclaimed, "What?" The DA slammed his hand down on the table. "Your Honor, this is absurd. She's clearly lying." Harper remained calm. "I'm not." She cut in sharply. "I passed the California bar exam last year. You can look me up." Harper Freeman, licensed attorney. The judge's jaw tightened. He turned to the court clerk. "Verify that." The room fell into dead silence. The only sound was the rapid clicking of the clerk's keyboard. The wait felt endless. Finally, the clerk looked up, wide-eyed. "It's true," she whispered. "Harper Freeman is a registered attorney with the State Bar of California." The gallery erupted, louder this time. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding order. But even he looked shaken. His voice was unsteady. "You're telling me," he began, "that you're a licensed attorney at your age?" Harper stood tall. "Yes, Your Honor," she said firmly. "I graduated high school early, earned my degree, and passed the bar exam. And now I'm here." The DA sputtered, his face red with fury. "This is highly irregular. She can't. She shouldn't even be allowed to." The judge silenced him. "And this moment right here, this is why you can never let anyone define your limits. They might underestimate you. They might laugh at you. But when the time comes, shock them. Prove them wrong. backhand index pointing right, medium skin tone like, and subscribe if you believe that intelligence, resilience, and courage can break any barrier. Let's keep rewriting the rules. The courtroom was electric. Harper's revelation had shattered every expectation in the room. She was no longer just a defendant. She was a force to be reckoned with. Judge Breener leaned forward, clasping his hands on the bench. His tone was quieter but no less firm. "All right, Miss Freeman," he said. "You've got everyone's attention. Let's see if you can back it up." Harper took a deep breath, keeping her composure intact. "Thank you, Your Honor." She turned to face the prosecution. "The first issue we need to address is the prosecution's reliance on circumstantial evidence. Let's take Exhibit B, the surveillance footage." The district attorney, still fuming, folded his arms. "The footage clearly shows you at the scene of the crime," he snapped. Harper nodded slightly. "It shows someone who looks like me near the scene. But what you failed to mention, intentionally or not, is that the timestamp on the footage is missing. The video was also retrieved from an unverified source, violating the chain of custody." She turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, without proper authentication, this evidence should be inadmissible." The judge glanced at the DA, his brow furrowed. "Is this true?" The DA hesitated, his mouth open and closed as if searching for the right words. "The footage is reliable, is it?" Harper pressed. Her voice was calm but sharp. "Because I have a forensic analyst report here that outlines all the inconsistencies in the file. May I submit it to the court?" The judge gestured for her to proceed. The bailiff delivered the report to the bench. The judge skimmed through it, his expression darkening with each passing second. "This raises serious questions." His voice was quieter now, more cautious. The DA looked like he wanted to disappear. "Your Honor, this is just a tactic to derail the case." Harper didn't miss a beat. "It's called due process," she interrupted. "Something you seem to have overlooked." A murmur of approval spread through the gallery. People were starting to believe her. Some were even rooting for her. But Harper wasn't done. She walked back to her table, picking up another document. "Next, let's discuss Exhibit D, the so-called confession." The DA gritted his teeth. The defendant voluntarily signed that confession after questioning. Harper tilted her head slightly. Without legal representation, she turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this document was signed after hours of interrogation without an attorney present. Under federal law, that's a clear violation of my rights." The DA shot back. "You didn't request counsel." Harper didn't blink. "I didn't have to." Her voice was steady. "Minors are entitled to legal representation. Period. That's the law." She turned back to the judge. "But let's put that aside for a moment. Even if we entertain this so-called confession, it's riddled with inaccuracies. For example, the address listed in the statement, it's wrong. I've never lived there. That's public record." The judge's face was unreadable. He slowly turned to the DA. "Do you have an explanation for this?" The DA stammered, flipping through his papers as if the answers would magically appear. You don't." Harper cut him off. "Because you didn't do your homework. You assumed this case would be an easy win. You assumed I wouldn't fight back. But here we are." The judge held up a hand, silencing them both. The tension in the room was palpable. Every eye in the gallery was on Harper. Judge Breener leaned back in his chair. "Miss Freeman," he said slowly, "what exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" Harper straightened her posture. "I'm trying to show this court that the justice system isn't about winning or losing. It's about truth. And the truth is, This case is built on shaky evidence and even shakier assumptions. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge looked momentarily stunned. Because at this moment, Harper Freeman wasn't just defending herself. She was dismantling the system that had underestimated her. And she wasn't finished yet. The courtroom was eerily quiet. The weight of Harper's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Judge Breener sat motionless, his fingers interlaced as he studied her. The confidence in her voice, the precision of her arguments, it was undeniable. Finally, he spoke. "Well," he began, his tone more measured than before. "Miss Freeman, you've certainly given us all a lot to think about." Harper stood tall, her hands lightly resting on the table. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She simply waited, calm and composed, as though she already knew what was coming. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Hensley, it's clear to me that there are significant issues with the evidence presented in this case." He picked up the forensic analyst report and held it up. "The chain of custody for Exhibit B is compromised. Exhibit D, the so-called confession, was obtained in direct violation of the defendant's rights." His gaze hardened. "I have no choice but to dismiss these pieces of evidence." A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. People leaned in closer, whispering to each other. Some nodded in quiet approval. Others shifted in disbelief. The district attorney's face turned red. "Your Honor, with all due respect." "With all due respect," the judge interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. "You should have done your job better. This is my courtroom, and I won't allow it to become a circus." The DA slumped in his chair, defeated. Harper remained still, waiting. Judge Breener let out a slow breath, his eyes softening as they returned to Harper. "Miss Freeman," he said, his tone quieter now, "I must admit, I misjudged you. I assumed you were just a kid, out of her depth. I was wrong." Harper let his words settle before finally responding. "Thank you, Your Honor. But this isn't about me. This is about holding everyone, prosecutors, judges, and even attorneys like myself, to a higher standard. That's what justice should be." The judge nodded slowly. "Well said." He took a deep breath before delivering his final decision. "Based on the lack of credible evidence and the procedural errors brought to light, I have no choice but to dismiss this case. Miss Freeman, you are free to go." The gallery erupted. Some people clapped. Others whispered furiously, while a few stormed out, clearly dissatisfied. Harper stood still for a moment, letting the weight of it all wash over her. Then, with a small, respectful nod to the judge, she gathered her papers and turned to leave. As she walked down the aisle, people parted to let her through. Some looked at her with awe, others with newfound respect. But Harper didn't linger. She pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped into the sunlight. "Now, let's be honest. If this story shook you, imagine how many others need to hear it. Justice is rarely handed out, it's fought for. Don't let this message stop here. Share this story, like this video, and make sure more people know that intelligence, resilience, and determination can defy even the strongest opposition. Because today, Harper didn't just win a case. She proved that the underestimated can change everything. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Harper Freeman, the underestimated young attorney, had flipped the case on its head. The judge, once dismissive, was now hesitant. The prosecution, once confident, was floundering. But Harper wasn't finished. Judge Breener rubbed his temples, and frustration was evident. "Miss Freeman, you've certainly made an impression. But let's be real here. This is highly irregular." Harper met his gaze without fear. "What's truly irregular, Your Honor, is allowing a case to proceed on weak evidence. We don't convict based on convenience. We convict based on facts. The district attorney, his face red with frustration, slammed his palm onto the table. Your Honor, this is absurd. This is a mockery of the court. We can't let... Judge Breener lifted a hand, silencing him. The courtroom fell into a hush. His gaze lingered on Harper, as if searching for a flaw, a weakness. Anything that could undermine the girl who had just outmaneuvered seasoned professionals. But Harper stood unwavering, not just as a defendant, not just as a lawyer, but as a symbol of defiance. The judge let out a long sigh before finally delivering his ruling. Based on the procedural violations, the mishandling of evidence and the lack of credible proof, I have no choice but to dismiss this case. Miss Freeman, you are free to go. For a moment, the courtroom stood frozen in disbelief. Then, like a slow-building wave, the gallery erupted, gasps, murmurs, some clapping, others storming out in frustration. Harper had done it. She gathered her papers, her expression calm as she turned toward the heavy courtroom doors. As she passed the district attorney, she caught the flash of resentment in his eyes. He had underestimated her. They all had. But the law doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to those who understand it. Outside, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust in her face. Harper Freeman, how did you pull this off? She turned to the camera, her voice measured. The law is meant to protect everyone, not just those who fit a certain mold. People like me, young, black, underestimated. We're more capable than they think. Today wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about proving that intelligence and determination don't come with an age limit. The world has witnessed what happens when someone refuses to accept the limits placed upon them. Now it's your turn. If you believe in standing up against injustice, if you refuse to let the world tell you what you can and cannot achieve, like, subscribe and share this story. The fight doesn't end here. It begins with you.